Hello there, and welcome back to another quiet night of sleepy science. Tonight we are going to spend a few slow hours with one of the strangest stories our species has ever told itself. A tall figure in the snow, a line of footprints crossing a glacier at 19,000 feet, going nowhere, coming from nowhere. A name that was mistranslated once in a newspaper office and never corrected. The Yeti is usually filed away as a fairy tale, and in a sense it is. But underneath the fairy tale there is something else, something that almost nobody bothers to look at. There are real expeditions with real budgets. There are real hairs in real laboratories run through real genetic sequencers by real scientists who published their results in real journals. There are bears with strange feet. There are mistranslations and museum specimens, and a permit system that once required climbers to promise not to shoot anything they could not identify. So tonight we are not going to tell you that the Yeti exists. We are also not going to pretend the story is empty. Everything you hear from here on is checkable. Every expedition happened. Every laboratory result was published. Every mistranslation was made by someone with a name and a deadline. Sometimes the truth is smaller than the legend. Sometimes it is stranger. And sometimes the most interesting thing about a monster is the shape of the hole it leaves behind when you finally look closely and find nothing there. In this video, we will follow the story from the first written mention in the 1830s, through the golden age of snowman expeditions, into the genetics laboratories of the last 15 years, and out into the high, thin, oxygen-starved air where the human mind starts inventing company. If you enjoy these gentle nights of science, you are welcome to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below whenever the mood takes you. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your shoulders drop. Let the room go quiet around you. Let your eyes grow heavy. And as the day fades behind you, come with me up into the cold, clean air, where the snow keeps its records for a while and then lets them go. Let's begin. The oldest written account of a hairy man of the Himalaya in a European language appeared almost 2 centuries ago. In 1832, the naturalist Brian Houghton Hodgson published a note in the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. Hodgson was living in Nepal at the time, and he wrote that his local collectors had fled from a creature they described as tall, hairy, and without a tail. Hodgson himself never saw it. He thought, calmly and without much drama, that it was probably an orangutan, an animal that does not live within 1,000 miles of Nepal. What matters is not that he was right, because he almost certainly was not. What matters is that the report exists, dated and printed, sitting quietly in a scientific journal for nearly 200 years. The story did not begin with a hoax or a headline. It began with a footnote. The second important account came from a man who was mostly interested in maps. Lawrence Waddell was an army surgeon and an explorer, and in 1899, he published a book called Among the Himalayas. In it, he described finding large footprints in the snow in Sikkim, and he described his porters telling him they belonged to a hairy, wild man. Waddell wrote down what they said, and then he wrote down what he thought, which was that the tracks belonged to a bear. He noted that he had never met anyone who had actually seen the creature, only people who knew someone who had. That small observation, made more than 120 years ago, turns out to describe almost the entire history of the subject. The evidence is always one person away. Waddell's observation has a name now in the study of rumor. It is called the friend of a friend structure, and folklorists have found it in urban legends on every continent. The story is always attributed to a source who is close enough to be credible and far enough away to be unreachable. My porter's brother saw it. My grandfather's cousin was there. What makes the structure so durable is that it cannot be checked without effort, and by the time anyone makes the effort, the story has already been told to 9 other people who will retell it without the attribution at all. Waddell wrote this down in 1899 in a book mainly concerned with mountain passes, and then moved on to the next chapter. He had identified the engine of the whole phenomenon before the phenomenon had a name, and he did not seem to think it was worth dwelling on. the name most of the world uses is a mistake. In 1921, a British reconnaissance expedition to the north side of Everest, led by Charles Howard Bury, crossed a high pass and found tracks in the snow. The Tibetan porters used a phrase that Howard Bury wrote down as Meto Kongmi. A journalist named Henry Newman, working in Calcutta, translated it for his readers. Kongmi means something close to snowman. Meto he rendered as abominable. It is a loose translation of a word that carries a sense of filthy or foul, the way you might describe a wet dog. Newman later admitted he had chosen the word because it sounded good. It did sound good. It has outlived him by a century, and it has colored the way an entire planet imagines an animal that may never have existed. It is worth pausing on how casual the whole thing was. Newman was writing a color piece for a newspaper in a colonial city, filing to a deadline, working from a phrase written down phonetically by a mountaineer who did not speak Tibetan, spoken by porters who may have been describing 3 different animals, or none. There were at least 4 points in that chain where the meaning could slip, and it slipped at all of them. Newman lived a long time, and he addressed the matter more than once in later life, always with a kind of amused ownership, as a man who knows he has done something small that will not be undone. 100 years later, in every language into which the word has been carried, the creature is still abominable. Howard Bury himself did not believe in a snowman. In his own account of that 1921 expedition, he wrote that the tracks were probably made by a wolf, and that the loping gait of a wolf on soft snow can leave prints that look far larger and stranger than the animal that made them. He also noted, with something close to affection, that his porters had an entire vocabulary for the creature and enjoyed using it. This is worth holding on to as we go. The very first Western observer to see the very first famous footprints looked at them, shrugged, and said wolf. The mystery did not come from the mountain, it came from the newspaper. The local names are older and far more interesting than the English one. In Sherpa and Tibetan speech, the sounds usually written as yete, mete, and zute describe different things. Yete is often given as something like the animal of the rocky place. Mete carries a sense of man-bear. Zute means roughly big thing, and it is very widely understood to refer to a large bear, an ordinary flesh and blood animal that people in the region have known about forever. Yeti, the word almost everyone in the world now uses, is an English flattening of yete. We took 3 words that pointed at 3 different ideas, mashed them into one syllable pair, and then went looking for a single animal that would fit. In Bhutan, the creature has another name entirely. It is called the Migoi, or the Mere God, which is often translated as wild man or strong man. In Bhutanese accounts, the Migoi is not simply a large ape. It is a being with the ability to become invisible, and in some tellings, it walks with its feet pointed backwards so that its tracks lead away from where it has actually gone. Notice what this does. A zoological animal leaves tracks that tell you where it went. A Migoi leaves tracks that lie. That is not a description of biology. That is a description of a mountain that cannot be read and of the limits of what a footprint can tell you. For many Sherpa and Tibetan communities, the Yeti was never a species in the way a snow leopard is a species. It belonged to a category of beings that also includes mountain spirits, guardians of hidden valleys, and forces that punish people who behave badly in high places. Anthropologists have pointed out, gently and repeatedly, that when a Western expedition asked a Sherpa guide whether the Yeti was real, the 2 people in that conversation were often not discussing the same kind of thing at all. One was asking about an animal that could be shot and measured. The other was answering about something that lives in the same part of the mind as luck and weather and the proper way to behave on a mountain that is also a god. Tibetan Buddhist tradition includes the idea of the Bayul, the hidden valleys. These are places described as physically real and spiritually concealed, sanctuaries that reveal themselves only to those prepared to see them. The Khumbu region below Everest is regarded as one of them. It is difficult to overstate how differently a story lands in a landscape like that. In a Bayul, a creature that appears and vanishes is not an anomaly to be explained. It is exactly what the place is supposed to do. The mountain is not hiding an animal from science. The mountain is doing the thing the mountain does. Western expeditions almost never grasped this, and the misunderstanding produced some very strange interviews. Climbers would ask a monk whether he had seen the Yeti, and the monk would answer that, of course the creature is there, and the climber would write in his diary that a religious authority had confirmed the sighting. But the monk had not been asked and had not answered a question about zoology. He had been asked whether the mountain has a character, whether the high places are inhabited by forces that respond to human behavior. And he had said yes, because in his cosmology, that is simply true, in the way that gravity is true. The mistake was never in his answer. It was in the tape recorder. A photographer named N.A. Tombazi produced one of the most careful early sightings and then quietly explained it away himself. In 1925, Tombazi was traveling near the Zemu Glacier in Sikkim as a member of a British geological expedition, and he was, by profession, a photographer and a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. He described seeing a figure moving across the snow at some distance below him, upright, dark against the white, occasionally stooping to pull at something growing near a rock. He watched it for perhaps a minute, then it was gone. When he reached the place, he found footprints, 16 of them, roughly 6 inches long. Tombazi was a meticulous man, and he did not claim a monster. He wrote that the figure was almost certainly a wandering ascetic, one of the hermits who lived in those hills and sometimes walked barefoot through snow as a religious practice. That was his own conclusion. The world remembered the sighting and forgot the explanation. This happens so consistently that it should probably be treated as a law. The evidence and the interpretation travel together for a very short distance, and then they separate, and only one of them keeps moving. Howard Bury said wolf, and the world heard snowman. Shipton said this was the only clear print, and the world saw the print. Hillary said myth, and the world remembered that Hillary had gone looking. Tombazi said hermit, and the world kept the figure on the snow. In every case, the person closest to the event, with the most information and the least incentive to embellish, offered a mundane reading. And the mundane reading was quietly discarded somewhere between the mountain and the printed page. Nobody decided this. It is simply what a story does when it is passed along by people who are tired and interested and telling it in a warm room. The photograph that made the Yeti famous was taken on the last day of a survey by a man who did not much care about monsters. On the 8th of November, 1951, the mountaineer Eric Shipton was returning from a reconnaissance of the Everest region with the Dr. Michael Ward and a Sherpa named Sen Tensing. At around 18,000 feet on the Menlung Glacier, they came across a line of tracks in the snow. Shipton photographed one of them with his ice axe laid beside it for scale, and then with Ward's boot beside another. The image of that single print, dark-toed and improbably wide, went around the world. It is still, 75 years later, the single most reproduced piece of Yeti evidence in existence. It is also, by the admission of the men who took it, the only clear print in a long trail of blurred and melted ones. They photographed the best one. Anyone would have. Shipton, for what it is worth, seems to have enjoyed the fuss and never quite committed himself. He was one of the finest mountain travelers of his generation, a man who believed in going light and looking closely, and he did not build a career on the photograph. Michael Ward, who was there, later wrote about the tracks with an honest scientist's discomfort, noting the number of prints, their condition, and the impossibility of drawing firm conclusions from snow. Sen Tensing, the third man present, was the one who gave the creature a name for the visitors. 3 people stood on a glacier for a few minutes. One took a picture. 75 years later, the picture is still working, and the 3 of them are gone, and the snow they stood on has melted and refrozen 10,000 times. The Shipton print has one property that almost nobody mentions. and it is the property that explains everything. Snow does not preserve a footprint, snow edits it. Under strong, high-altitude sun, the walls of a track melt back and the print widens. Under wind, the sharp edges blur. Where several animals step in a line, or where one animal places a hind foot into the impression left by its front foot, the two prints merge into a single, strange shape with too many toes. Michael Ward himself, decades later, discussed the photograph in print with obvious ambivalence, noting the difficulty of reading tracks in such conditions. A footprint in fresh snow is a measurement. A footprint in old snow is a rumor that grows all afternoon while the sun is out, and then freezes into whatever shape it happened to be in at dusk. There is a straightforward test of this, and it has been done many times by people who track animals for a living. Go out at dawn and photograph a fresh print with a ruler beside it. Return at noon and photograph the same print. Return at dusk. The track is measurably larger every time, and the toes, which begin as distinct small depressions, merge and round and deepen until they read as something else entirely. Nothing about the animal has changed. Everything about the evidence has. Any expedition arriving at a track more than a few hours old is, without knowing it, measuring the weather. The 1950s turned the snowman into an industry. Within 3 years of the Shipton photograph, a British newspaper, the Daily Mail, funded and dispatched an actual expedition to find the creature. It was in the field through the first months of 1954, led by the mountaineer John Angelo Jackson, with the journalist Ralph Izard filing dispatches. They walked hundreds of miles, they photographed rock paintings, they examined a supposed Yeti scalp kept in a monastery at Pangboche. They collected hairs from it, they found footprints, and they found the same problem everyone finds, which is that a footprint is a shape without an owner. They came home with no animal. What they brought back instead was an audience, which turned out to be far easier to catch. It is worth naming the incentive structure honestly, because it explains a great deal of what followed. A newspaper does not need to find a snowman. A newspaper needs a story that runs for 12 weeks and sells papers on days when nothing else is happening. From that point of view, the expedition succeeded completely, and it would have succeeded slightly less well if it had found the animal, because then the story would have ended. Every subsequent search operated in the shadow of this arrangement. The mystery was worth more unsolved than solved to almost everybody involved except the scientists, who were the ones with no money. For a few years, the search for the Yeti was funded by Texas Oil. Tom Slick was an American businessman, an heir to an oil fortune, and a man with a genuine, unembarrassed appetite for unsolved zoological questions. Between 1957 and 1959, he financed a series of expeditions into Nepal to look for the creature, hiring experienced fieldmen and equipping them properly. Slick's expeditions were not a joke. They collected physical samples, they interviewed villagers systematically, and they brought back the first material that anyone could put under a microscope. Slick died in a plane crash in 1962 at 46, and the funding died with him. It is a small, strange fact of intellectual history that the most sustained scientific hunt for the Yeti was paid for by petroleum and ended in a Montana snowstorm. One relic from those expeditions has a story that is stranger than any monster. In the Pangboche monastery, there was a mummified hand, dark, clawed, and described by the monks as the hand of a Yeti. In 1959, a member of Slick's team, Peter Byrne, was permitted to examine it. By his own later account, given openly in interviews, he removed several finger bones and replaced them with human bones so that the hand would still look complete. The stolen pieces were reportedly carried out of Nepal in the luggage of the actor James Stewart, who was traveling in India at the time. That is not folklore. Byrne told the story himself, on the record, for decades. When those bones were finally tested for DNA around 2011, the result came back human. The most famous debunking of the Yeti was carried out by the most famous climber alive. In 1960 and 61, Edmund Hillary, 7 years after standing on the summit of Everest, led a long scientific expedition into the Khumbu, sponsored in part by an American encyclopedia company. It was a serious effort, with a prefabricated hut placed at high altitude for physiological research, and among its aims was the resolution of the snowman question. The zoo director, Marlin Perkins, and the writer, Desmond Doig, went with him. They negotiated with the village of Kumjung for permission to borrow the monastery's Yeti scalp, and they carried it to laboratories in Chicago, Paris, and London. The Kumjung scalp turned out not to be a scalp. Analysis showed it was molded from the shoulder skin of a sero, a goat-like animal, Capricornus thar, that lives on steep Himalayan slopes and is entirely uncontroversial. The hairs matched. The structure matched. The object was probably made as a ritual object, a headdress, not as a forgery, and it had likely been in the monastery for a very long time, doing exactly the work a sacred object is meant to do. Hilary returned it to the village. He then said, publicly, that he had found no convincing evidence of the Yeti at all, and that he believed the creature was a myth. It is worth sitting with how rare that is. A man who could have kept a mystery alive for the rest of his life simply gave the answer he had found. Nepal once had an official Yeti permit. In 1959, as expeditions began arriving with the specific intention of hunting for a snowman, the Nepalese government issued regulations, and a memorandum summarizing them circulated through the United States Department of State and survives in its files. The rules were three. First, an expedition wishing to search for the Yeti had to pay a royalty of 5,000 rupees to the government. Second, the creature could be photographed or captured alive, but it could only be killed in self-defense. Third, any news of a discovery had to be given to the government of Nepal before it was released to the press. Read those three rules again. They are not the rules of a country that believes in a monster. They are the rules of a country that has correctly identified where the actual value lies. The permit fee was not trivial for the time. And the third rule, the one about telling the government before telling the press, is the sharpest thing in the document. Nepal had watched foreign expeditions arrive, use its mountains, its porters, and its stories, and then publish the results in London and New York. The Yeti regulations are, read closely, an early and rather elegant assertion of sovereignty over a national asset. The asset simply happened to be imaginary, which changed nothing about its value, and arguably made it easier to protect. The Soviet Union had a state commission for the study of the snowman. In 1958, following reports from the Pamir Mountains, the Academy of Sciences of the USSR established a commission to investigate the question of the snowman, chaired for a time by the historian Boris Porshnev. It funded field trips. It published bulletins. Porshnev developed an elaborate theory that the creature was a surviving population of relict hominids, Neanderthals who had never quite gone extinct, retreating into the least habitable corners of Asia. The commission produced no animal. It was wound down within a few years. But for a brief window in the late 1950s, two rival superpowers with nuclear arsenals both had people on the government payroll looking for a hairy man in the mountains, and neither of them found one. There is something almost tender in that. It was the one thing the Cold War could agree on. The Himalayan brown bear is the quiet answer to almost every question in this story. It is a real animal, Ursus arctos isabellinus, a subspecies of the same brown bear that lives in Alaska and Siberia and the forests of Romania. It is pale, sometimes almost sandy, sometimes silvered along the shoulders. It lives at high altitude in the western Himalaya and into the Karakoram and Pamir. It is now rare, and in India, its remaining population is thought to number only in the hundreds, scattered across a few protected valleys. It can stand upright. It can walk a few steps upright. It leaves a hind footprint with 5 toes and a broad heel. And if you saw that print in soft snow, without context, without the animal, you would not think bear. You would think something else. Most people, for 100 years, have thought something else. Bears walk in a way that makes their tracks lie. A brown bear is plantigrade, meaning it puts the whole sole of the foot down, heel included, the way a human does, unlike a dog or a deer which walks on its toes. That already makes a bear's hindprint unsettlingly human. Then there is the gait. Bears often place the hind foot directly into or partly overlapping the print just made by the front foot. The two impressions fuse. What is left in the snow is a single print that is too long, too wide, and has an extra cluster of toe marks at the front, sometimes making it look as though the toes are on the wrong side. Track a brown bear across a snowfield and you will find, again and again, a trail of large barefoot prints made by something that does not have bare feet. Bear trackers have a word for this. The overlapping print is called a direct register, and in soft snow it produces a shape so persuasive that experienced field biologists have to remind themselves what they are looking at. Add a day of sun. Add a slope so that the bear's weight shifts and the toes drag. Add a second bear following the first in the same line, which mothers and cubs routinely do. What you have at the end of that is a single trail of enormous, deep, human-like prints, striding across an empty glacier, in a place where no human has walked, made by an animal that is at that moment asleep in a hollow, under a rock 2 valleys away. There is a second kind of Himalayan bear, and it may explain a different set of stories. The Asian black bear, Ursus tibetanus, is smaller, darker, more thickly furred around the neck, and it climbs. It is common through the forested middle hills of Nepal, Bhutan, and northeast India. It also, more than most bears, spends real time on its hind legs, standing to reach fruit or to look around. A black bear standing at the edge of a forest at dusk, seen from a distance by someone walking home, is a dark, upright figure with a hunched head and long arms. Local names in the region distinguish carefully between the big bear and the man bear. Western expeditions collapsed the distinction and then went looking for the thing that was left over. There is also, in Tibetan folklore and in a handful of zoological records, the blue bear. Ursus arctos pruinosus is a brown bear subspecies of the Tibetan plateau with a strange, frosted, blue-gray cast to its coat. It is one of the rarest bears in the world and has almost never been studied alive in the wild. Very few Westerners have seen one. Its skins, however, have circulated, and several of the pelts that have been presented over the years as Yeti skins have been identified as blue bear. The animal is real. It is genuinely mysterious. Its coat is genuinely strange. And it is not a snowman. It is a bear that most bear scientists have never laid eyes on, which is arguably more remarkable. The mountaineer Reinhold Messner spent years chasing the Yeti and came home with a bear. Messner, the first person to climb Everest without supplementary oxygen, described an encounter in eastern Tibet in 1986 with a large, upright, silent animal that terrified him. Rather than let it go, he spent much of the following decade investigating, traveling through Tibet, Nepal, and Bhutan, collecting accounts, examining relics, and reading the folklore in the local languages instead of in translation. His conclusion, published in his book about the search, was that the Yeti of the mountain people is the Kimo, the Tibetan brown bear, an animal that is both an ordinary creature and a figure of real fear. He was not thanked for this. Solving a mystery is a good way to lose an audience. In 1966, the Kingdom of Bhutan put the Yeti on a postage stamp. The set is triangular, brightly colored, and it names the creature the Migoi. Bhutan has never been shy about this. The Migoi appears in official cultural material, in tourism literature, and in the reasoning sometimes offered for the protection of large tracts of eastern wilderness. The Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary, in the far east of the country, is frequently described as having been set aside in part as a refuge for the Migoi. Whether or not anything hairy is walking around in there, the sanctuary protects several hundred square kilometers of intact temperate forest, red panda, and blood pheasant. A myth was used to buy a forest. This is one of the more successful transactions in the history of conservation. The modern scientific era of the Yeti began with a genetics laboratory in Oxford issuing a public appeal. In 2012, the human geneticist Brian Sykes announced that he would accept samples of hair, skin, and other material from anyone who believed they had physical evidence of an unknown primate, and that he would sequence them properly. Dozens of samples arrived, from museums, from collectors, from expedition archives, from monasteries. Most were exactly what a cynic would predict. They were cow, horse, dog, raccoon, porcupine, bear and human. Sykes published the results in 2014 in a Royal Society journal. What is remarkable about the study is not its findings. It is the fact that a serious geneticist was willing to test the material at all, publicly, and to publish whatever came back. 2 of Sykes' samples produced a result nobody expected. A hair from Ladakh and a hair from Bhutan gave a genetic sequence that, in his analysis, matched a fragment of ancient DNA recovered from a polar bear jawbone from Svalbard, tens of thousands of years old, and did not match modern brown bears. Sykes suggested, carefully, that there might be an unknown bear in the Himalaya, perhaps a hybrid lineage carrying ancient polar bear ancestry. The press did not report it carefully. For a season, the Yeti was a bear, and the bear was a ghost. It was a beautiful hypothesis. It lasted about a year. The polar bear result was taken apart by other scientists, politely and completely. In 2015, the biologists Eliezer Gutierrez and Ronald Pine re-examined the sequence and pointed out that it was extremely short, around 100 base pairs, and that a fragment that short is simply not diagnostic. When compared against a wider set of brown bear sequences, the same fragment matched living brown bears from the Himalaya perfectly well. There was no ancient polar bear. There was an ordinary bear and a piece of DNA too small to carry the weight that had been placed on it. Sykes responded, and the exchange stayed civil. This is what the correction machinery of science looks like when it works. A claim was made in public, tested in public, and reduced in public in under 2 years. The definitive study came in 2017, and it was done by a bear specialist. Charlotte Lindquist, an evolutionary biologist who works on bear genomics, assembled a set of samples that had been collected as Yeti material across the Himalaya and the Tibetan Plateau. These were not random hairs sent in by hopeful members of the public. They included bone, tooth, skin, hair, and feces, drawn from museums and private collections, including material from a monastery and from an expedition archive. 9 of them were purported Yeti. Lindquist and her colleagues sequenced their mitochondrial genomes, not short fragments but whole mitochondrial sequences, which is a far higher standard of evidence. The results were published in a Royal Society journal. There is no ambiguity in them at all. Of the 9 purported Yeti samples, 8 were bears. They were Asian black bear, Himalayan brown bear, and Tibetan brown bear. The 9th was a dog. That is the entire physical evidence base for the most famous unknown animal on Earth, examined with modern methods, and it comes out as 3 species of bear and somebody's dog. It is easy to hear that as a punchline. Try hearing it instead as a completed experiment. For more than a century, people said, if only somebody would test the samples properly. Somebody did. The samples were tested properly. The answer arrived, and it was quiet, and it was bears. What is easy to miss is how good the evidence base actually was by the standards of the field. These were not hairs picked up from a trail by a hopeful tourist. They came from monastery relics, from expedition collections, from a mummified specimen, from material that had been guarded and revered and pointed to for decades as the strongest physical evidence in existence. The believers chose the samples. The samples were the best case. And the best case, sequenced properly, came out as 3 species of bear and a dog. There is no version of this result that a skeptic manufactured. It was assembled over a century entirely by people who were sure. The bear study found something genuinely new and almost nobody noticed. In sequencing all that bear DNA, Lindquist's team was able to look at the deep history of Himalayan bears for the first time. The Himalayan brown bear, it turned out, sits on a lineage that separated from other brown bears very early, on the order of 650,000 years ago, during a period of major glaciation. The bears of the Tibetan Plateau, which look similar, belong to a quite different branch. For hundreds of thousands of years, 2 populations of brown bear have lived on opposite sides of the same mountains without merging. So the Yeti hunt did produce a discovery. It just was not the discovery anyone had paid for. It was a hidden chapter in the family history of an animal we thought we already knew. There is a further wrinkle that makes the result more elegant than a disappointment has any right to be. Because the Himalayan brown bear separated so early, and because the plateau bears took a different road, the two lineages have been evolving in parallel on either side of the same wall of rock for a period longer than the entire existence of our genus in its modern form. They look alike, they behave alike, only their mitochondria remember that they are not the same. Every Yeti hair that was ever sealed in an envelope and carried down a mountain by a hopeful expedition was, without anyone knowing it, a message from one or the other of those two lineages, waiting for someone to build a machine capable of reading it. It took about 120 years. The message said, "We have been here longer than you." There is a lesson buried in that result about what mysteries are for. Every expedition, every stolen finger bone, every mistranslated Tibetan syllable, every hair sealed in an envelope in a monastery, all of it eventually funneled into a laboratory in New York State, where a scientist who cared about bears learned something true about bears. The energy people put into the impossible thing did not vanish. It was spent, and it bought a small, permanent piece of knowledge about the real world. This happens more often than you would think. The search for perpetual motion clarified thermodynamics. The search for the philosopher's stone built the first chemistry laboratories. Chasing a ghost is inefficient, but it is not nothing. The oldest surviving idea about what a Yeti might actually be involves an extinct ape the size of a small doorway. Gigantopithecus blacki was a real animal, and it is one of the strangest entries in the primate fossil record. It lived in what is now southern China and mainland Southeast Asia. Estimates of its size vary widely and depend on a great deal of reconstruction. But by any reasonable measure, it was the largest ape that has ever lived, considerably larger than a gorilla. It is known almost entirely from teeth. Thousands of teeth and a small number of lower jaw bones. No skull, no limbs, no pelvis. We have never found a Gigantopithecus foot, which is inconvenient for a theory built on footprints. The way Gigantopithecus was discovered is a small masterpiece of accident. In 1935, the paleontologist Ralph von Koenigswald was picking through an apothecary shop in Hong Kong. Traditional Chinese pharmacies sold fossil teeth, ground into powder under the general name of dragon bones. Among them, von Koenigswald found an enormous molar, unmistakably that of an ape, far larger than any ape known to science. He bought it. Over the following years, he acquired more from similar shops, and eventually the cave that supplied them were located. An entire extinct giant was reconstructed from material that had been sitting for centuries in medicine drawers, on sale by the gram, to people with toothache. For a while, Gigantopithecus was widely imagined as a giant upright ape, a plausible ancestor for every hairy man story from Tibet to Oregon. This idea was pushed hardest in the 1970s and 80s, and the anthropologist Myra Shackley was among those who took the possibility of relict hominids in Asia seriously enough to write about it academically. The appeal is obvious. Here is a real, enormous, extinct ape in roughly the right part of the world. But the fossils never cooperated. There is nothing in the jaw structure or the teeth to suggest an upright walker, and the wear patterns on those teeth suggest an animal grinding through very tough, fibrous plant material in forests at low altitude. Not a creature of ice. In 2019, a technique called paleoproteomics finally told us what Gigantopithecus actually was. A team led by Frido Welker managed to extract surviving proteins from the enamel of a Gigantopithecus molar around 2 million years old, in a subtropical cave where DNA would have degraded long ago. Proteins are tougher than DNA. By comparing the sequences, they showed that Gigantopithecus was a close relative of the orangutan, sitting on the orangutan branch of the ape family tree, having split from it around 10 to 12 million years ago. So the animal at the heart of every Yeti hypothesis was not a giant human cousin at all. It was a giant, distant, red-haired cousin of an animal that lives in the trees of Borneo, and it went extinct anyway. And it did go extinct, and now we know roughly when and why. A large study published in 2024 dated the disappearance of Gigantopithecus to somewhere between about 295,000 and 215,000 years ago. The picture that emerged was of a highly specialized animal, dependent on a particular kind of fruit-rich forest, unable to adapt as the climate turned drier and the forest fragmented into grassland. Its smaller relative, the orangutan, adjusted its diet and its behavior and survived. Gigantopithecus, enormous and specialized, did not. It has been gone for at least 200,000 years, which is longer than our own species has existed in its current form. Nothing walks on its feet in the snow tonight. The extinction of Gigantopithecus is also, in its own quiet way, the most sobering thing in this entire subject. Here was the largest primate that ever lived, an animal that would have made any human being who saw it feel exactly the way the Yeti is supposed to make people feel. And it existed, and there is no argument about it, and it is gone. It did not vanish into a mountain range or hide from science. It ran out of forest. The teeth we grind into medicine were once in the jaw of the thing we are still looking for, and it has been dead for longer than any story has been told. Whatever the Yeti is, it is not a survivor of that lineage. But it may be a memory of the fact that such a thing was once possible and that the world was once big enough to hold it. Every so often, a national army announces a Yeti. In 2019, the official account of the Indian Army posted photographs of enormous single footprints in the snow near Makalu Base Camp and described them in writing as belonging to the mythical beast Yeti. The prints were reported as roughly 32 inches long and 15 inches wide. Mountaineers and biologists responded almost immediately, pointing out that the tracks were in a single line rather than paired, which is not how a walking biped moves, and that they were entirely consistent with a bear whose overlapping prints had melted out and merged in the sun. The army did not withdraw the post. What that episode really recorded was not an animal. It was how badly a very serious institution wanted for one afternoon to be part of the story. Snow is an unreliable narrator, and the reason is physics. When sunlight falls on a footprint at high altitude, the walls of that print absorb slightly more heat than the flat snow around them because the angled surface catches the low sun. The walls retreat. The print grows outward, hour by hour, keeping roughly its shape while gaining size. Overnight, the enlarged shape freezes hard. The next morning, it is a crisp, sharp, enormous track. Anyone arriving at midday on day 2 is looking at a genuine footprint of a real animal that has been magnified by a day of weather. There is no deception involved. The snow simply does what snow does, and the animal that made the print has long since gone down the valley to look for something to eat. At the altitudes where Yeti tracks are found, snow often does not melt at all. It sublimates, passing directly from ice to vapor without ever becoming water, because the air is so dry and the pressure so low. Fields of snow at those heights can develop into penitentes, tall blades of ice leaning towards the sun like a crowd of hooded figures, sometimes taller than a person. Walking through a field of penitentes at dusk, with the light going and the wind moving between them, is a documented and reliably unnerving experience. Nobody has ever needed a monster to feel watched in a place like that. The place supplies the feeling on its own, out of nothing but geometry and evaporating ice. Wind builds shapes in snow that look designed. Sastrugi are the sharp, ridged waves carved into a snow surface by persistent wind, and they can be knee-high and razor-edged, running in long, parallel lines across a plateau. Cornices curl over ridgelines like frozen waves. Sun cups pit the surface into a honeycomb of shallow bowls. All of these things create pattern, shadow, and repetition, and all of them can hold a track, distort a track, or manufacture something that looks like a track from nothing but the interaction of snow, sun, and wind. In the mountains, you are never looking at a blank page. You are looking at a page that has been written on all night by forces that were not trying to tell you anything. Sound behaves strangely in cold mountain air, which is why the silence is not silent. In very cold conditions, air near the ground is colder and denser than air a little above it. And this temperature inversion bends sound waves back down towards the surface, rather than letting them escape upwards. The result is that a noise made a long way off can arrive unnaturally clearly, as though it were close. Snow, meanwhile, absorbs high frequencies, so what reaches you is stripped of its treble, low and soft and hard to place. A rockfall 2 valleys over becomes a footstep behind you. This is not superstition. It is acoustics, and it is measurable. And it has been frightening people in mountains for as long as there have been people in mountains. The snow leopard is real. It lives exactly where the Yeti is supposed to live. And for most of the 20th century, almost nobody could photograph one. The naturalist George Schaller obtained some of the first images of a wild snow leopard in the 1970s in Pakistan. Peter Matheson traveled with him and wrote a famous book about the search in which he never saw the animal at all. Snow leopards are pale, patterned to dissolve into rock, capable of moving across terrain that stops a human, and they can go their entire lives without being noticed by anyone. Here is the point. A large predator can genuinely be almost invisible in that landscape. The Himalaya really does hide things. That is precisely what makes the Yeti story so hard to kill. The Himalayan wolf turned out to be its own ancient lineage, and it took until the 21st century to establish this. Genetic work published in recent years has shown that the wolf of the Himalaya and the Tibetan Plateau is not simply a gray wolf that happens to live high up. It is a deeply divergent lineage, adapted to low oxygen, with distinctive variants in genes involved in oxygen transport. It had been walking around in plain sight, being photographed and shot and written about, and it was quietly a different thing than everyone assumed. Its footprints, incidentally, when they overlap on soft snow, are among the most convincing false monster tracks there are. Charles Howard Bury said so in 1921, and he was right, and it took 100 years for us to notice that the wolf itself was the interesting discovery. There are monkeys on the snow, and they are not being talked about enough. The Assam macaque and the Nepal gray langur both range high into the Himalaya, and the langur in particular is a large, long-limbed, pale gray primate that sits upright, moves through snow, and has a black face fringed with unruly white hair. Seen at distance, on a ridge, in flat light, a big male langur is a gray man-like shape with a startlingly human posture. There are also, further north and east, other high-living monkeys entirely comfortable in snow. The Himalaya has real primates. They are not secret, they are not enormous, and they have been sitting in the corner of the photograph the whole time. The single most important thing about high mountains, for our story, is that above about 8,000 feet, the human brain begins to run short of oxygen. At the altitude of the Shipton footprint, around 18,000 feet, each breath contains roughly half the oxygen it would at sea level. By the summit of Everest, it is closer to a third. The brain is the most oxygen-hungry organ in the body, consuming a fifth of the supply while making up a 50th of the mass. When that supply drops, the brain does not simply slow down. It starts to make things up. This is not weakness or superstition. It is the ordinary, documented behavior of neural tissue that is not getting what it needs, and it happens to trained, calm, experienced people. Climbers have a name for the presence that walks beside them. It is called the third man factor, after a line in a poem that itself referred to Ernest Shackleton, who reported that during his crossing of South Georgia, he and his two companions each felt, persistently, that there was a fourth person with them. The mountaineer Frank Smythe described sharing his rations on Everest in 1933 with a companion who was not there. Reinhold Messner has described something similar during a solo ascent. The sensation is not a hallucination in the ordinary sense. There is usually nothing to see. It is a felt certainty of company arriving unbidden in people who are exhausted, cold, isolated, and short of oxygen. It is one of the most consistently reported experiences in all of mountaineering. The phenomenon is not confined to mountains. It has been reported by single-handed sailors, by polar explorers, by survivors of shipwrecks and mining accidents, by people who have walked out of deserts, and by the people who came down out of the World Trade Center. The common factors are physical exhaustion, sensory monotony, isolation, and mortal danger, and the presence is almost always described as benign. It walks alongside. Sometimes it gives instructions. Sometimes it merely accompanies. Whatever mechanism generates it appears to be doing something useful, arriving at the exact moment when a person is closest to giving up and staying until they are safe. Of everything in this story, this is the part that most deserves not to be laughed at. There may be something in us that, when we are alone enough, manufactures a companion, and it saves lives. Neuroscience has some idea where the sensed presence comes from. Researchers have been able to induce a similar feeling in a laboratory, in healthy volunteers, by disrupting the ordinary agreement between what the body does and what the body feels. The brain maintains a model of your own body in space, assembled from vision, from the inner ear, from the position sense in your joints. When that model is confused, in some circumstances, the brain appears to generate a second body and to place it nearby and to attribute agency to it. Fatigue, cold, hypoxia, monotony, and isolation all degrade exactly the signals that model depends on. So the figure that follows you across the snow may be, quite literally, you, copied, misfiled, and standing a few steps behind. Sleep at altitude is broken in a very particular way, and it may matter here more than anyone has admitted. Above roughly 10,000 feet, most people develop a breathing pattern during sleep called periodic breathing, in which the breath deepens, then fades away to nothing for several seconds, then starts again. It happens because the body's oxygen sensors and its carbon dioxide sensors, which normally cooperate, begin to argue in thin air. The result is that a climber at a high camp surfaces from sleep dozens of times a night, gasping, in the dark, in a tent, with no idea how long is passed. Half-woken, oxygen-starved, and disoriented is not a good state in which to interpret a noise outside. It is, however, the ordinary nightly state of everyone who has ever camped near where the footprints are found. The mind reaches for faces before it reaches for anything else. Pareidolia, the tendency to see meaningful patterns, particularly faces and figures, in random visual noise, is not a flaw. It is a feature with a very old survival logic. A creature that mistakes a shadow for a predator loses a moment. A creature that mistakes a predator for a shadow loses everything. So the system is deliberately tuned to over-report. In a landscape of rock and snow and shifting light, with almost nothing in it that resembles a body, the pattern-finding machinery does not switch off. It runs harder on less data. And out of scattered boulders on a distant slope, it assembles a shape that is standing up and looking back. Whiteout removes the horizon, and with it, scale. In flat light, when cloud and snow share the same brightness, the human visual system loses every cue it uses to judge distance and size. Shadows disappear. Contours vanish. Climbers in whiteout have walked off cliffs they could not see and have stepped over crevasses without noticing. In those conditions, a raven 20 feet away and a bear 200 yards away project the same image on the retina, and there is no honest way to tell them apart. Many of the great sightings in this story happened in bad light on featureless snow. Not because monsters prefer that weather, but because that is the weather in which the eye stops being a reliable witness. Memory does not store an event and play it back. Every time you recall something, the memory becomes briefly unstable, and it is written back to storage in a slightly modified form, colored by what you now know, what you have since been told, and what the story sounds like when it is told well. This process is called reconsolidation, and it is one of the more unsettling things neuroscience has established. It means that a man who saw an indistinct shape on a glacier in 1925, and who told that story 400 times over the following 40 years, was not lying when the shape acquired shoulders. He was remembering. Remembering is a form of gentle, continuous, well-intentioned editing, and none of us is exempt. Cold changes the way people think, and it does so before they notice. Mild hypothermia impairs judgment, slows decision-making, and narrows attention. And one of its cruel features is that the impairment includes the ability to detect the impairment. Add altitude and the effect compounds. Search and rescue teams have long known that a lost person in cold conditions makes worse and worse decisions while feeling calmer and calmer about them. In the accounts of Yeti encounters, you will find a striking number of witnesses who were exhausted, freezing, hungry, and hours from shelter. Their testimony is not worthless, but it was collected under the worst possible conditions for collecting testimony by an instrument that was quietly malfunctioning and did not know it. Some of the best Yeti sightings were probably real animals, badly identified at long range. That is not a dismissal. It is the ordinary condition of wildlife observation. Even experienced field biologists misidentify animals at distance, in poor light, when the animal is doing something unexpected. The literature on eyewitness identification of species is not flattering to anyone. Distance is systematically underestimated. Size is systematically inflated by fear and by novelty. Color drains out of the visual system in dim light before shape does, so an animal seen at dusk is remembered as darker than it was. Take a brown bear on a slope at 400 meters in cloud, seen for 2 seconds by someone who has been walking for 8 hours. What you get back is not a lie, it is just not a bear. The Yeti has an unusually well-documented relationship with commerce. Nepal has an airline called Yeti Airlines, founded in the late 1990s, and a group of trekking lodges named after it. There are Yeti brands of beer, of clothing, of coolers, of chocolate. The Nepalese tourist industry has made a functional mascot out of a creature that its most famous mountaineer publicly declared did not exist. None of this is cynical. Every mountain region on Earth sells its stories along with its passes and its rooms, because a story is the one export that does not weigh anything and never runs out. The Yeti is now, in a very literal accounting sense, one of the most economically productive animals in the Himalaya, despite the inconvenience of not being there. The creature entered European children's imaginations through a comic book about grief. Tintin in Tibet, drawn by Hergé and published as an album in 1960, features a Yeti prominently. It was made during a period of severe personal crisis for its author, who was suffering from recurring nightmares of whiteness, and it is widely regarded as the most personal thing he ever produced. In it, the Yeti is not a monster. It is a lonely creature that has been caring for an injured boy, and it watches him leave. Millions of European children met the abominable snowman for the first time in that book, and what they met was something sad, protective, and misunderstood. That is a long way from Henry Newman's headline. Cinema went the other way. The 1957 British film, The Abominable Snowman, written by Nigel Neal and starring Peter Cushing, was released while the Slick expeditions were still in the field, and it is a surprisingly thoughtful piece of work. Its creatures are intelligent, patient, and waiting for humanity to finish destroying itself. Nearly every subsequent screen Yeti has been cuddlier. The stop-motion Bumble in the 1964 Rudolph special, who turns out to be fine once his tooth is pulled. The furry monsters of animated comedies. 2 separate animated films in the space of 2 years in the late 2010s, both featuring a friendly Yeti befriending a child. In the space of 60 years, the abominable snowman became a plush toy. Very few monsters get to retire that comfortably. There is a real animal named after the Yeti, and it lives 2,000 meters underwater. In 2005, a research submersible working near hydrothermal vents in the South Pacific on the Pacific Antarctic Ridge brought up a blind white crab with long arms covered in dense, pale, hair-like bristles. It was so unlike anything known that it required a new genus and eventually a new family. Scientists nicknamed it the Yeti crab, and it was formally described as Kiwa hirsuta. The bristles are not hair. They are colonized by bacteria that the crab farms and eats in total darkness beside water hot enough to melt lead. The Yeti was never in the mountains. The unknown animal was underneath the ocean the entire time, and it was hairy, and nobody had noticed. the deep sea keeps doing this. Every serious submersible expedition to a hydrothermal vent field returns with species new to science, sometimes dozens of them, sometimes entire families. The vent ecosystems themselves were only discovered in 1977, which means that for the whole of the golden age of Yeti hunting, nobody on Earth knew that there were flourishing communities of large animals living in total darkness on chemical energy rather than sunlight. That was a genuinely unimaginable discovery, in the strict sense that nobody had imagined it. It required no folklore, no expedition sponsored by a newspaper, and no belief. It required a ship and a light, and somebody willing to look somewhere nobody had thought to look, which is the only method that has ever worked. North America has its own version, and its name is a borrowed word that got worn smooth. Sasquatch comes from Saskets, a word in Halkomelem, a Salishan language of southwestern British Columbia. It was brought into English in the 1920s and 30s, largely through the writing of a schoolteacher and Indian agent named John W. Burns, who collected accounts from the communities he worked among and needed a single word for what he was hearing. Before Burns, there was no Sasquatch because there was no single creature. There were many beings in many languages with many different characters and moral functions, some dangerous, some comic, some sacred. Burns flattened them into one animal for an English-speaking readership, and then the English-speaking readership went looking for it in the woods. The pattern is precisely what happened in the Himalaya with Yete and Mete and Zute on a different continent among different people at roughly the same moment in history. Two colonial encounters, two acts of translation, two monsters born in the gap between languages. It is worth noticing that in both cases, the outsiders arrived, misheard a category, and then spent a century searching for the thing they had accidentally invented, while the people who lived there watched and were mostly polite about it. Asia is full of the Yeti's cousins, and they follow the terrain. In Mongolia and the Caucasus, there is the Almas, described as smaller and more human, more like a wild person than an ape. In central China, there is the Yuren, the wild man, whose reported range overlaps neatly with the remotest forested mountains of Hubei and Shaanxi, and which prompted its own official Chinese scientific expeditions in the 1970s and 80s. On Sumatra, there is Orang Pendek, the short person, described consistently as a small, upright ape of the rainforest, a figure that a number of serious biologists have regarded as the least implausible of all such stories. Notice what these creatures have in common. They live at the exact edge of where the local human population stops going. Not in the empty desert and not in the town, but in the last band of country that is still reachable and still not owned. The wild man is not distributed by ecology. He is distributed by the boundary of settlement, which moves and which he moves with, always staying just past the last field. The word cryptozoology was coined in the middle of the 20th century, and it has had a complicated life. The Belgian zoologist Bernard Heuvelmans published a book in 1955 surveying reports of unknown animals from around the world, and the Scottish-American naturalist Ivan T. Sanderson worked along similar lines. Between them, they gave the pursuit a name and a certain scholarly dignity. Heuvelmans was not a crank. His starting point was entirely reasonable, which is that large animals had been discovered by science with surprising regularity in the preceding century, and that the discovery of the okapi in 1901 or the Komodo dragon in 1912 would have sounded absurd shortly before it happened. The problem was never the premise. The problem was the method. Zoology proceeds from specimens and works outward. Cryptozoology proceeded from stories and worked inward, and a story is infinitely flexible. It will accommodate any evidence and survive any absence of it. Heuvelmans wanted a science of hidden animals. What he got, in the end, was a very large library of things that people said. Large land mammals are still being discovered, but the pattern of those discoveries tells against the Yeti. The saola, a striking horned bovine, was found in the forests of Vietnam and Laos in 1992, and it was a genuine shock. New species of monkey, of muntjac deer, of peccary, of whale have been described in recent decades. But look at how it happens. Almost always the animal is medium-sized or smaller. Almost always it lives in dense forest at low or middle altitude. And almost always the first evidence is a body part in a hunter's house or a skull on a village wall, not a footprint. A large ape standing on two legs, living above the tree line in one of the most heavily trekked mountain ranges on Earth, would need food, and it would need a breeding population of hundreds. It would leave hair on branches, feces on trails, and bones in caves. The Saola was hiding in a forest. There is nowhere to hide on a glacier. Camera traps have quietly changed what it means to say an animal is unseen. Across the Himalaya, tens of thousands of motion-triggered cameras have been deployed over the last 2 decades, largely for snow leopard and tiger surveys, running unattended for months at a time in exactly the terrain the Yeti is said to occupy. They have photographed snow leopards at over 5,000 meters. They have photographed brown bears, wolves, lynx, and takin. In 2019, a camera in the Indian Himalaya recorded a snow leopard and a brown bear on the same trail. The cameras do not get tired, do not have opinions, and do not suffer from hypoxia. They see in the dark. They have been watching those valleys day and night for years. They have never once photographed anything that anybody has been unable to name. Environmental DNA has made the mountains even harder to hide in. Every animal sheds cells constantly, into water, into soil, into snow. Modern sequencing can take a liter of stream water and recover a list of the vertebrates that live upstream of it without ever seeing one of them. The technique has found rare and secretive species in rivers where no survey had ever confirmed them. It is now being used in high-altitude Asia. If there were a population of large apes living in a Himalayan watershed, drinking from its streams, dying in its valleys, the DNA would be in the water. It would not be a matter of luck or fieldcraft or patience. It would be a matter of taking a sample and reading it. This is the quiet, decisive way modern biology closes an old question. Not with an expedition, but with a bottle. None of this proves that nothing is there, and it is worth being honest about that. You cannot prove a negative. What the evidence establishes is something more modest and more useful, which is that the probability has become very small, and that every piece of physical material ever offered has, on examination, belonged to a known animal. Scientists sometimes describe this as the absence of evidence where evidence should be. If you look in the right place with the right tools for long enough, and you find nothing, that nothing begins to carry real weight. It is a different situation from never having looked. We have looked. We looked with newspapers, with oil money, with a government commission, with a knighted mountaineer, with mitochondrial sequencing, with camera traps, with water samples. The mountain has been asked the question in every language we have. It keeps returning the same answer, and the answer is bear. There is one more possibility that scientists take more seriously than the internet does, and it is not a monster. It is that some Yeti reports describe human beings. The Himalaya has always had hermits, ascetics, and wanderers, living far above the villages, some of them practicing austerities that involve extreme exposure to cold. There were also, historically, people living at the margins of settled society for less spiritual reasons. Tumbazi, who saw the figure at the Zimu Glacier in 1925, said exactly this, and it was his own first explanation, offered without any prompting. A distant, ragged, unclothed human figure moving across snow, seen by a person from a different culture who does not expect to see anyone there at all, is a perfectly sufficient explanation for a great many stories. The wild man of the mountains may have been, more often than we would like, simply a man who was in the mountains. Tenzing Norgay, who stood on the summit of Everest with Edmund Hillary, believed in the Yeti, and he had a reason. His father, a Tibetan yak herder, told him that he had seen one, close, and had been badly frightened, and that afterwards he had fallen ill. Tenzing repeated this account and did not disown it. He also worked for decades alongside the Western climbers who were systematically failing to find any trace of the creature, and he saw the scalp taken away for testing and brought back with a verdict. So here are two men who reached the same summit together, and who reached opposite conclusions about the mountain's most famous inhabitant. Hillary said myth. Tenzing said his father would not have lied to him. Neither position is stupid. They are answers to slightly different questions. Hillary was asked whether there is an unknown large primate in the Himalaya. Tenzing was asked whether his father had told him the truth. And a family memory of terror passed from a man to his son is a real thing in the world, whatever it was that stood on the slope that day. It just is not a specimen. In Sherpa folklore, the Yeti is often dangerous in a specific, instructive way. There is a widely told story in which villagers, plagued by the creature, sit in a clearing and pretend to drink strong liquor from bowls, and pretend to hack at one another with their knives, using water and using the blunt side of the blade. The Yeti, watching from the trees, imitates them. It drinks real liquor. It uses the sharp edge. The story ends with the Yeti destroying itself through its own compulsion to copy. This is not a nature documentary. It is a piece of moral instruction about mimicry, about the danger of doing what you see without understanding why, and about the difference between a person and a thing that only looks like one. Something similar appears in wild man tales from Europe, from Japan, from the Americas. The monster in the woods is very often not a monster at all. It is a mirror held up at a safe distance so that a village can look at its own worst habits without anyone taking offense. There are relics still sitting in Himalayan monasteries, and their history is more complicated than a hoax. The scalp at Kumjung, the one Hillary borrowed, is back where it belongs and is still shown to visitors. The Pangboche Monastery held both a scalp and the hand from which Peter Byrne removed the finger bones. In 1991, both of the Pangboche relics were stolen, and they have never been recovered. Consider what actually happened over the course of that century. A community kept a sacred object. Foreign visitors arrived, examined it, doubted it, tested it, took pieces of it, wrote books about it, and eventually, someone simply took the rest. It is a small story, but it is the whole colonial history of curiosity in miniature. We arrived asking whether the object was authentic. That was never the interesting question. The interesting question was whose it was, and we did not ask that one. The mountaineer Don Whillans reported a sighting on Annapurna in 1970, and it is quoted more often than it is examined. Whillans, a famously unsentimental and hard-headed climber, said that while camped high on the mountain, he saw, by moonlight, a dark ape-like shape bounding along a ridge. He was not a man given to romance, but he was also, at the time, at high altitude, alone in the dark, at the end of a hard day, on a mountain that would go on to kill a member of his party. He had already noticed strange tracks. He was, in other words, primed. Whillans himself was equivocal about what it meant. The sighting is genuinely interesting as testimony, and it is worth exactly what all such testimony is worth, which is a record of what a reliable man's visual system delivered to him under conditions where visual systems are known to be unreliable. Being tough does not protect the occipital lobe from a lack of oxygen. Japan sustained a patient, unshowy search for the Yeti for nearly 30 years. A mountaineer named Yoshiteru Takahashi organized repeated expeditions into the Dhaulagiri region of Nepal from the 1990s onward, setting camera traps, casting footprints, and interviewing residents. He reported a sighting himself in the early 1970s, and he spent much of the rest of his life trying to get a photograph. He never did. Media coverage of these expeditions tended to focus on the hope and skip the outcome, which is a general feature of Yeti reporting and worth naming. The pattern is that an expedition sets out, is covered widely, finds tracks, is covered widely, and then finishes without a result and is covered by nobody. If you built your understanding of the field from headlines alone, you would conclude that the evidence keeps accumulating. In fact, the same evidence keeps being found, and the same evidence keeps failing, and the failure is never news. The comparison people always reach for is the mountain gorilla, and it deserves a straight answer. Western science did not describe the mountain gorilla until 1902, when a German officer named Robert von Behrens shot 2 of them in the Virunga Mountains. The okapi, a forest giraffe, was described in 1901, the Komodo dragon in 1912. The coelacanth, an entire lineage of fish presumed extinct for 60 million years, was pulled from a trawler's catch off South Africa in 1938. These are all real, and they are all cited, correctly, as evidence that big surprises are possible. But every one of them was found the same way. Somebody produced a body. Within a few years of the first report, in each case, there were specimens, measurements, and skeletons in museums. The mountain gorilla went from rumor to type specimen in a single expedition. The Yeti has had 125 years, a state commission, a newspaper, an oil fortune, and a genome sequencer, and it has produced no body at all. Footprints are the easiest evidence in the world to manufacture, and this has been demonstrated. In North America, after the death of a man named Ray Wallace in 2002, his family produced the carved wooden feet he had used to make giant tracks in the 1950s, and a logger named Rant Mullins had earlier admitted to carving similar feet decades before. It does not follow that all footprints are hoaxes. Most, on the balance of evidence, are melted bear tracks. But it establishes the cost of the evidence, which is essentially zero. 2 pieces of wood, a quiet night, and soft ground. When a class of evidence can be produced by anybody with an afternoon and a sense of humor, that class of evidence cannot, on its own, establish the existence of a species. This is not a hostile standard. It is the same standard we apply to every other animal, all of which have met it easily by the simple expedient of being real. Belief in the Yeti has proved almost completely resistant to the evidence, and that resistance is itself the interesting phenomenon. When the 2017 genetic results were published, showing 8 bears and a dog, the story ran for a day. Belief did not measurably move. This is not because people are foolish. It is because the Yeti was never, for most of the people who hold it dear, a hypothesis about zoology. It is a piece of furniture in the imagination, and it does work there. It marks the edge of the map. It certifies that the world is not yet fully inventoried. Psychologists studying the persistence of belief have repeatedly found that a claim held for social, emotional, or identity-related reasons is barely touched by evidence directed at its factual content, because the evidence is aimed at a target the belief is not standing on. To kill the Yeti, you would have to offer something else that does the same job. Nobody has. This is worth saying without contempt, because the impulse is not a bad one. A person who wants the Yeti to exist is expressing a wish for a world that is larger than the inventory, and there is nothing shameful in that wish. The mistake is only in where they have chosen to place it. The world is larger than the inventory. It is larger in the deep ocean, in the soil, in the ice cores, in the proteins locked inside 2-million-year-old teeth, and in the strange fact that a bear on one side of a mountain range has been quietly not being the same species as a bear on the other side for longer than we have been human. None of that requires belief. All of it requires only that somebody keep looking carefully and be willing to be told that what they found was not what they wanted. The mountain at the center of all this was measured again quite recently, and it had grown. In 2020, after a joint survey, Nepal and China announced an agreed height for Everest of 8,848.86 meters, a little higher than the figure most of the world had been using. The revision was not a correction of a blunder. It reflected better instruments, satellite positioning, ground-penetrating radar to find the rock beneath the summit snow, and a political agreement between 2 countries that had previously preferred slightly different numbers. It also reflected the fact that the mountain is genuinely moving. Everest sits on a collision that began around 50 million years ago, when the Indian plate drove into Asia, and the collision has not finished. The range is still rising, on the order of a few millimeters a year, while erosion tears it down almost as fast. So the highest place on Earth is not a monument. It is an argument between uplift and weather, currently being won by uplift by a matter of millimeters, in a contest that has been running longer than there have been primates of any kind. The snowman is the least remarkable thing about that mountain. The valley where the most famous footprints were photographed is now a national park. Sagarmatha National Park was established in 1976 and inscribed as a World Heritage Site 3 years later, protecting the Nepalese approaches to Everest, the Khumbu Glacier, and the Sherpa villages within it, including Kumjung with its scalp. Edmund Hillary was deeply involved in the region for the rest of his life, and the schools and clinics he helped build are still working. There is a kind of symmetry in this that is easy to miss. The man who went looking for the Yeti, found nothing, and said so plainly, is the same man who then spent 40 years doing unglamorous, concrete, useful things in the valleys where he had failed to find it. The expedition that killed the legend was also the expedition that produced the friendships that built the hospital. Nobody sets out for that, but that is very often how the ledger comes out once enough time has passed for the accounting to be honest. Tens of thousands of people now walk through Yeti country every year. The Khumbu region receives large numbers of trekkers annually, moving in a slow procession up a well-marked trail, through lodges, over bridges hung with prayer flags, with mobile signal in many places and helicopters overhead. Higher up, hundreds of climbers queue on fixed ropes near the summit in the short weather windows of spring. It is one of the most photographed landscapes on the planet, carried in the pockets of everyone who visits, recorded by cameras that upload automatically. If a large upright ape lived along the tree line of the Khumbu, it would by now have been photographed by an accountant from Ohio with a phone. The absence of that photograph, in an age when a photograph costs nothing and everyone has one, is not proof. But it is a fact of a certain weight, and the weight has been increasing every year for 2 decades. Look at where the sightings actually cluster, and the geography tells you something. Very few Yeti reports come from the true high-altitude wasteland, the rock and ice above 6,000 meters where nothing lives at all. Most come from the tree line, that band of stunted birch and rhododendron and juniper where the forest gives out roughly between 3,000 and 4,000 meters, and from the alpine meadows just above it. This is exactly the zone that people traverse, that yaks graze, and that bears use. It is the busiest wild country in the Himalaya. It is also, crucially, the zone with the most cover, the most confusing light, the most broken ground, and the most large mammals. The Yeti is not distributed where a snow-adapted giant would live. It is distributed where humans and bears meet, at dusk, in bushes. A standing brown bear is taller than almost everyone reading this. A large male Himalayan brown bear on all fours may stand a little over a meter at the shoulder, but reared up on its hind legs, it can reach well over 2 meters, sometimes more, with the head thrown forward and the forelimbs hanging. Bears rear up for a specific reason, and it is not aggression. It is information. A standing bear is trying to see, and more importantly, to smell, lifting its nose into cleaner air. It is a gesture of curiosity, and it is usually the prelude to leaving. To a human observer at 200 meters, in poor light, that same posture reads as an upright, hairy figure, standing still, looking directly at them, deciding something. The bear is doing arithmetic about the wind. The human is doing arithmetic about their own mortality. Both leave with a story, and only one of them tells it. Bears at these altitudes spend a large part of the year underground. The Himalayan brown bear dens through the winter, typically from around October into April or May, in a cavity dug into a slope or wedged under boulders, its heart rate and metabolism falling dramatically, while its body temperature drops only a few degrees. It does not eat, drink, urinate, or defecate for months, recycling waste products internally in a way that medical researchers study with envy, since a human confined to bed for that long would lose bone and muscle catastrophically. When the bear emerges in spring, it is thin, disoriented, and extremely hungry, moving into the high meadows just as the snow begins to break up. This is precisely the season of the classic footprint reports. Shipton's photograph was taken in November, at the other end of the cycle, when the bears were preparing to disappear. The snow of a Himalayan spring is a record of very hungry animals, freshly awake, walking a long way. What a bear eats up there would not sustain a monster. In the high Himalayan summer, brown bears dig marmots out of their burrows, an activity that leaves the ground looking excavated by machinery. They eat roots, tubers, alpine plants, insects, carrion, and in the worst years, livestock, which is why the relationship between bears and herders in the western Himalaya has always been tense. It is a thin living. A large animal at that altitude survives by being able to shut itself off for half the year, and by being willing to eat almost anything for the other half. This is the real constraint on any hypothetical Yeti, and it is more decisive than any absence of photographs. The energy is simply not in the landscape. A population of large apes cannot live above the tree line for the same reason that no large ape lives above the tree line anywhere else on Earth. There is nothing to eat. The animal the bears are digging for is worth knowing about, and it screams. The Himalayan marmot is a heavy, sandy-colored rodent that lives in colonies in the alpine grassland, often above 4,000 meters, and it sits upright on its hind legs beside its burrow to watch for danger. When it sees something, it whistles, a piercing note that carries a long way across open ground and is picked up and repeated by its neighbors. Trekkers who have not been warned about this find it deeply strange, because the sound is not animal in any way they recognize. It is the sound of somebody signaling, an entire hillside of upright figures turning to face you, calling to each other, and then vanishing into the earth all at once. Nobody has ever mistaken a marmot for a Yeti. But if you want to understand why people come down from those slopes feeling watched, you should know that up there they are. The other large mammals of the high Himalaya are strange enough on their own account. The takin is a heavy, golden, awkward creature that looks assembled from a bison, a goat, and a moose, and it is the national animal of Bhutan. Blue sheep, which are neither blue nor sheep in any straightforward sense, cross cliffs that seem to have no surface. Ibex, argali, and Himalayan tahr all move through terrain where a human would need a rope. Any of these, glimpsed briefly in cloud, at distance, at the edge of exhaustion, could be almost anything. The Himalaya is not short of animals, it is short of visibility. The mountains generate a permanent shortage of the one thing that identification requires, which is a clear, unhurried, second look. Birds solved the Himalaya long before we did, and their solutions are extraordinary. The bar-headed goose crosses the range on migration, flying at altitudes where the air holds a fraction of the oxygen it does at sea level, powered by hemoglobin that binds oxygen more tightly than ours, by lungs that move air in one direction rather than in and out, and by a heart that can drive blood through muscle at a rate no mammal can match. Alpine choughs, glossy black crows with yellow bills, have been seen scavenging at Everest's high camps, higher than any bear will ever walk, waiting for climbers to open a food bag. Lammergeiers, enormous bearded vultures, drop bones onto rock to break them open, and have done so for so long that the practice appears in ancient art. None of these animals is hidden. All of them do things that would have been dismissed as impossible if someone had merely reported them. It is worth noticing that the true marvels of that landscape were established the ordinary way, by people catching the animal, examining it, and publishing the result. Nature did not need to be exaggerated, it only needed to be looked at properly by somebody with a notebook and a great deal of patience. The smallest permanent resident of Everest is a spider, and it eats things that fall from the sky. Euophrus omnisuperstus, whose name means standing above everything, is a tiny jumping spider found on the slopes of Everest at altitudes above 6,000 meters, in rock crevices where nothing grows. Its name is an accurate description of its situation. There is no vegetation up there, and therefore no herbivores, and therefore, apparently, no food chain. What the spider eats are the springtails and small insects that are carried up from below on the wind and deposited on the snow. A constant faint rain of stunned and dying creatures from the warmer world. An entire ecosystem, several kilometers above the last plant, subsists on debris blown uphill. This is the kind of thing that is actually true about high mountains. It is stranger than a monster. It was found by an entomologist, and almost nobody has heard of it because it is very small and does not stand upright and cannot be photographed by accident. Most of the species on Earth have never been described, and this is the honest ground on which cryptozoology could have stood. Estimates vary enormously, but a very large fraction of living species particularly insects, fungi, nematodes, and marine invertebrates, have no scientific name. New ones are described at a rate of thousands per year. The world genuinely is full of unknown life. What is not full of unknown life is the category of large, terrestrial, conspicuous vertebrates in well-traveled places, because that is precisely the category we have been cataloging hardest and longest, and the returns there fell off a century ago. The unknown is not evenly distributed. It has retreated into the small, the deep, the microscopic, and the very cold. If you want to find something nobody has ever seen, do not go to the Himalaya with a rifle. Go to a rotting log with a microscope, and you will find something new before dinner. The Himalaya makes its own weather, and this is the source of everything unreadable about it. The range stands directly across the path of the summer monsoon, forcing warm, wet air from the Indian Ocean upward until it can hold no more moisture, dumping enormous rainfall on the southern slopes and leaving the Tibetan plateau behind it dry. Locally, this produces afternoon cloud that rises up the valleys like a tide, arriving almost on schedule, swallowing ridges that were sharp an hour before. The mountains are frequently invisible from villages that sit directly beneath them. Climbers speak of waiting days to see the peak they are standing on. Whatever else the Himalaya is, it is a machine for producing partial views. It shows you a fragment, takes it away, and returns it altered. That is not a mystical statement. It is a description of orographic lift, condensation, and the diurnal heating of a valley floor. But you could not design a better environment for growing a legend if you tried. The glaciers that hold the footprints are disappearing. Assessments of the Hindu Kush Himalaya region have found that its glaciers are losing mass at an accelerating rate, and that a substantial fraction of their ice is expected to be gone by the end of this century under most warming scenarios. The Khumbu Glacier, the one that runs beneath the Everest icefall, has thinned measurably within living memory. Snow lines are moving upward. Tree lines are creeping after them. The alpine meadow where the brown bear digs for marmots is being squeezed between a warming forest below and bare rock above, on a mountain that cannot grow fast enough to give it any more room. There is no drama in the way this is happening. It is happening at the speed of a few meters a decade, which is exactly the speed at which people fail to notice things. The snow that recorded the Yeti is being quietly withdrawn, and with it the surface on which the story was written. The genuinely endangered creature in this story is the bear. The Himalayan brown bear survives in fragmented populations across the western Himalaya, the Karakoram, and parts of the Pamir, and in India, its total number is thought to run to the hundreds rather than the thousands, scattered across valleys that are increasingly divided by roads, by tourism, and by conflict with herders whose livestock the bears sometimes take. Bears that raid rubbish dumps near military posts and hill stations become bold, and bold bears get killed. The species is protected on paper across much of its range. It is not well studied, it is not well funded, and it has nothing like the charisma of the snow leopard. For 100 years, the world sent expeditions into that landscape to look for an animal that was not there and walked past repeatedly, an animal that was, and that was disappearing. That is the actual tragedy of the Yeti. And it is not a metaphor. It is a population figure. There is a bleak symmetry in it. The brown bear of the Himalaya was for 100 years the explanation nobody wanted. The boring answer. The thing you were told when you had hoped for something better. It was, all along, the rarest and most remarkable large mammal in the range, carrying 650,000 years of separate history in its cells, denning under boulders at 4,000 meters, digging marmots out of frozen ground, walking upright for a moment to smell the wind. We spent the century looking past it. It is not clear that it has another century to wait for us to look again. A word choice in a newspaper office shaped a century of looking. If Henry Newman had translated meadow as filthy, which is closer to what it means, the creature would have entered English as the filthy snowman. And it is difficult to imagine expeditions being funded to find something with that name. Abominable is a word from the King James Bible. It carries sin and taboo and things that should not be. It promised not an animal, but a transgression. The people who set out to find the abominable snowman were, at some level below argument, going to look for something forbidden, and that is a different errand from going to look for a bear. Language does this constantly and invisibly. Call something a resource and you will use it. Call it a wilderness and you will protect it. Call a large brown mammal abominable, and men will spend fortunes and lifetimes chasing it across a glacier, and they will not stop when they are told, gently, in Tibetan, that the word for the big one just means the big one. Mistranslation has fathered more monsters than the imagination has. The unicorn appears to owe part of its existence to a Greek translation of a Hebrew word for a wild ox. The idea that Moses had horns comes from a Latin rendering of a word that probably meant that his face shone. The canals of Mars were canali, channels, in the original Italian, a word that says nothing about who dug them. In each case, a real thing passed through a language boundary and came out the other side, carrying an extra claim that nobody had made. This is not a failure of translators. It is a structural feature of moving meaning between systems that do not carve the world the same way. The Yeti belongs to this family. It is not a discovery, and it is not really a hoax. It is a translation error that acquired a body, a habitat, a postage stamp, an airline, and a permit fee over the course of 100 years because it was too good a word to waste. Nobody knows how many snow leopards there are, and that is a fact about us, not about the cats. Published estimates for the global population span a very wide range, and researchers are candid that a large proportion of the animal's range has never been surveyed with any rigor at all. The terrain makes proper counting brutally expensive. Even with camera traps and genetic sampling from scat, the numbers carry uncertainty that would be considered scandalous for a European songbird. Sit with that for a moment, because it cuts both ways. On the one hand, it means the Himalaya is still genuinely under-observed, and the people who say we cannot rule out surprises have a point that is not silly. On the other hand, it means that the effort we do have is being spread thinly across animals we know are there, animals that are declining, animals whose disappearance would be permanent and would be our fault. Every field season is a choice. Every camera has to be carried up on somebody's back. The question is never whether the mountain has secrets. The question is which of its secrets we can afford to go and find. Camera traps have taught us that large animals behave differently when nobody is present, and this quietly dissolves one of the oldest arguments for the Yeti. The classic defense has always been that the creature is shy, nocturnal, and avoids human beings, which is why it is never seen. But a camera on a tree is not a human being. It does not smell, it does not talk, it does not walk in a group of 8 wearing brightly colored jackets. Under camera observation, snow leopards patrol ridgelines calmly. Bears feed for hours. Wolves pass in family groups at 3 in the morning. Shy animals stop being shy the moment the source of their shyness leaves. The Himalaya has been under this kind of unblinking, unhurried, indifferent observation for 20 years. If there were something up there that avoided people, we would have it on film by now, precisely because the cameras are not people. That is the whole point of them. The myth has paid for a certain amount of real conservation, and it would be ungenerous not to say so. Tourism revenue in Nepal and Bhutan supports protected areas, employs local people as guides and wardens, and gives governments an economic argument for leaving forests standing. Some of that revenue exists because of a hairy figure on a poster. The Migoi helps guard a sanctuary in eastern Bhutan that holds red panda and blood pheasant and hundreds of square kilometers of unlogged temperate forest. There is an argument made seriously by some conservationists that a charismatic myth can do work that a data table cannot, and that if the story of an unseen creature keeps people out of a valley and money flowing into it, the creature has earned its keep several times over. This is uncomfortable if you care about truth, and it is difficult to argue with if you care about forests. Both things can be true at once. Most of the useful facts in the world are like that. There may be a reason our species keeps a monster at the edge of the map, and it has to do with what a finished world would feel like. Psychologists who study why people are drawn to the unexplained have noted that such beliefs cluster around the boundaries of the known, and that they tend to intensify when the sense of an open frontier is under threat. A world entirely surveyed, entirely named, entirely photographed from orbit is a world in which nothing is waiting. Some part of the mind refuses that. It is not stupidity. It is a preference for a world with a room in it that has not yet been entered. And the Yeti has been, for 100 years, an extremely useful occupant of that room. It costs almost nothing to keep him there. It costs a great deal, apparently, to admit that the room is empty and that the emptiness is our own doing, valley by valley, road by road. Children reach for monsters early, and they seem to be doing something practical with them. Developmental researchers have observed that fear of an imagined creature in the dark appears in very young children across cultures, before any specific story has been supplied. It looks less like a lesson learned and more like a piece of equipment switching on. A monster is a container for a feeling that does not yet have a name, and a child who can say there is something under the bed has done something significant. They have taken a formless dread and given it a location, a shape, and a boundary. Adults do exactly the same thing at a larger scale. There is something out there in the snow. The alternative, which is that the snow is simply enormous and cold and does not know you are in it, is much harder to hold. A monster is a mercy. It means the emptiness is at least paying attention. The last thing to say about the Yeti is that it has almost certainly saved lives. And it has done so by being frightening. In the mountain communities where the creature is taken seriously, the traditional advice is not to travel alone above the villages at dusk, not to linger in the high pastures after the weather turns, not to go into the upper valleys in the season when the snow is rotten and the slopes are loaded. These are the exact conditions in which people die of exposure, of avalanche, of a broken ankle 6 hours from anyone. A rule that says do not go up there when the light is failing is a rule that saves people. And a rule is much easier to keep when there is something in the dark to keep it for you. Every mountain culture on Earth has produced a version of this. The details change. The instruction does not. Stay down, come home. The thing that lives above the tree line is not always an animal. Sometimes it is the accumulated experience of everyone who did not come back, wearing fur, standing at the edge of the firelight, telling you plainly and effectively what the mountain will do to you if you are careless. Consider, at the end of all this, what the search actually found. It found the true history of the Himalayan brown bear, split from its relatives before our species existed. It found that Gigantopithecus was a cousin of the orangutan, and that its teeth still hold readable proteins 2 million years old. It found a cerro skin headdress in a monastery and returned it to the people who owned it. It found a crab that farms bacteria in the dark beside a volcanic vent and named it after a legend. It found the third man who walks beside exhausted climbers and traced him back to a confusion in the brain's model of the body. It found that snow enlarges footprints, that language builds monsters, that memory edits itself, and that a very short piece of DNA cannot carry a very large claim. Not one of these was the thing anyone was looking for. All of them are true, and all of them will still be true tomorrow, which is more than the Yeti ever managed. Perhaps the last honest thing to say is that the footprints were always real. That is not a small point, and it is usually lost. Somebody stood at 18,000 feet in 1951 on a glacier under a hard blue sky and looked down at a line of tracks that had been made a day or two earlier by a warm, breathing, living animal that had walked past that exact spot while no human being was there to see it. That animal existed. It had a heartbeat and hunger, and somewhere it was going. The only error in the whole 100-year story was the name we gave it. We looked at the evidence of an ordinary bear crossing an extraordinary place, entirely alone, entirely unobserved, at the top of the world. And we decided that could not possibly be enough. And the snow, which never agreed to any of this, keeps doing what it has always done. It receives the weight of whatever walks across it. It holds the shape for a night, or a day, or a season. The sun works at the edges, the wind rounds the corners. What was a print becomes a hollow, and what was a hollow becomes a shadow, and then the surface is smooth again and gives nothing back. Every animal that has ever crossed those glaciers has written its name there and had it erased, uncounted, unremembered, including every bear that ever became a monster, and including every one of the men who came looking. The mountain does not keep records, it only keeps snow. Everything else is something we brought with us, carried up, and left behind. Let the facts settle behind you now, like pages closing at the end of a long evening. You do not need to follow them. You do not need to remember the names or the dates or which bear was which. They will keep. Let the room become still. Let your breathing slow and find its own quiet rhythm without your help. Somewhere tonight, very high up, the snow is falling on a slope where nobody is standing. There are no footprints there yet. In the morning, there may be a few, small and unremarkable, made by an animal that has been alive for 600,000 years and is not thinking about us at all. It will move on down the valley, and by afternoon, the sun will have widened its tracks into something a person could get lost in. But nobody will be there to look, and by evening, they will be gone. You are not needed on the mountain tonight. There is nothing you have to find, and nothing you have to explain, and nowhere anyone expects you to be. If this quiet kind of science helps you rest, you are welcome to return whenever the night feels too loud. Another calm video will be waiting when you are ready. But for now, let the mountain go. Let the snow close over the last of the footprints. Let the facts become distant, and then faint, and then nothing at all. Sleep well, and good night.